Everyone, welcome to another On This Day in Canadian Military History live stream. Today, I'm excited to have a new guest to the channel and talking about war remembrance generally, but also kind of in the context of the British Dominions or the White Dominions. But more generally, this kind of came up from something on Twitter, which we'll get to in a second. But my guest today is quite accomplished and is in the process of moving elsewhere. So it's good to get him on before he heads down under to Australia, and why he brings such an interesting perspective for today. So today's guest is Robert Engen. He's got tons of books. If you're in the space, you know who he is, and he's done lots of great work. And I've used it myself, and he's helped me in that way. He probably doesn't even know that, but maybe we can talk about that later. But yeah, so I'm excited to have him on, and we're just going to kind of jump into it. And as always, if you have questions or comments and things we're talking about don't make sense, please let us know, because we've both been kind of doing this for a while, and sometimes we get lost in the terminology. So please let us know if anything's just kind of not making sense to you, or if something you want us to expand on, and we'll definitely do that for you. So thanks, Rob, for coming on. I really appreciate you coming on and having the idea to come on here and all of that. So thanks for coming.
Oh, it's a great pleasure, Brad. I'm a big fan of the show, big fan of what you've been working on, everything you've been doing. So thanks for letting me come on and hogging the day before Remembrance Day slot.
Yeah, no, it's my pleasure to have you on. Been wanting to get you on before, but I just know you've been so busy, and then you've announced you're moving, so I didn't want to bug you, but you came to me, so now I can bug you. So yeah, it was kind of your idea of this. I mean, I guess I kind of started it in a way to give you the idea. I don't even know what I was doing. I think I was done work early or something in downtown. I had some time to kill. So I went to the memorial, the War Memorial, which I'll be at again tomorrow, because I was at the archive, so it's not that far. It was a nice day. I went for a walk. I don't think anybody can blame me for that. So I just kind of got thinking. I always think about things while I'm there. And one of the things that's always kind of in my back of my head is the dates, right? They're kind of impossible to not notice. They're quite large, bronze numbers. One that's always stuck out to me and kind of confused me in a way is the dates for the South African War. And I posted that on Twitter. I just asked a question. I wasn't trying to really lead it in any way. Someone else has pointed out to me, maybe that wasn't the best course of action, but it is what it is.
It was an interesting course of action. We'll give you that.
Anyway, yeah, so that is what happened. I was expecting something different. And anyway, it kind of went from there. And you jumped on and had some thoughts, and you wanted to kind of chat. It kind of came from that. So kind of what are you thinking with that one? That was kind of something you wanted to lead off with, in sense of the idea for this, and that led to war and memory, and obviously tomorrow's Remembrance Day, so it's all kind of like a perfect mix of what's going on here, and I'm sure you've got some interesting thoughts about this, as I already know.
Well, I hope so. I'm not a historian of memory per se, but I've done a bit of traveling and seen how war memory is represented, particularly around the former British Dominions and the Commonwealth, and just with the work that I've done in the past with the Hill 70 Memorial Project and the PPCLI right now, it's the question of memory comes up a lot, and remembrance, and who are we remembering, and why why is it represented in certain ways, and it's a topic that is a bit of a minefield, as I think you probably discovered. That there's a lot of really heavily charged opinions about this as well. And that was I really appreciated what you were posting about the South Africa, the dates for the South African War, 1899 to 1902, and do they belong on the cenotaph? Why are they on the cenotaph? And there's a lot of back and forth in the discussion, but I think it is one of those quintessential questions that we really need to kind of examine more closely, because if we look at the South African War, it's a bit of it's kind of problematic, especially these days. It was, and that leads into a broader question of what exactly are we remembering, and why. So, I mean, South African War, it was in I think just about every way a war of aggression, that we were on the side of the aggressors. It was a war that featured the creation of the term concentration camps, that was deliberately targeting civilians on both sides to some degree, but overwhelmingly on the British side that
Mhm.
Canada was supporting, and that forcibly created the country of South Africa, which is a rich and troubled country to this day. I mean, it's not directly just because of that war, but it is, it was a turning point in that country's troubled history. And the the question then becomes, should those dates be on the cenotaph? Should that, is that what we are? Is that what do we want to remember all of the bad things? And I say this as someone who had ancestors who fought for the British and for the Canadians in South Africa, one of whom I'm fairly certain may have actually worked in one of the concentration camps. I mean, like this is something I personally grapple with, and that that I connect with personally. I have some fairly strong feelings about, and it was just such an interesting question, and interesting to see the range of reactions that we got from it. From some people talking about how, well, there was tens of thousands of Afrikaners and Black Africans who were killed, civilians who were killed in that war, who had nothing to do with it. That we were that our country's policies were in part responsible for killing in a war that, in historical hindsight, doesn't look like a terribly just endeavor.
Right.
And there's also and I think Brian Fennell, Farrell, who from Singapore, was weighing in with that, also saying that, well, if we're going to have 1899 to 1902 on the cenotaph, we should probably have 1885 on the cenotaph too, which, let me tell you, is the political hot potato that is never going to happen ever. But like, what are we remembering? Are we remembering the justness of the war? Are we remembering the goodness of the cause, or are we remembering those who lost their lives as a part of policy, who lost their lives pursuing the policy interests of the Canadian government, which in some ways the most inclusive way of thinking about remembrance and thinking about who should be honored by the cenotaph, which also means we probably shouldn't have dates on it at all, because that leaves out everyone who died in the peacekeeping missions, everyone who it puts brackets around service and says that only those who served in those particular wars are worthy of remembrance, or not worthy of remembrance, but that becomes the focus point of remembrance is those wars, and everyone who falls outside of that is kind of left out of that. And so I think it was a really fascinating discussion to have, and I thought that was one of the high points of my Twitter doom scrolling week, was looking at your discussion of that.
Well, thank you for saying that. I mean, I literally thought of it in the moment. I mean, I've thought about that before. I think I've discussed it on this channel before at some point or another. I don't think that's a brand new thought for it's definitely not for me, or for, I think, people who've been watching the channel for a while, or follow me on social media. But it just, in the moment, it just kind of hit me, because I don't know. It was a nice day.
Yeah.
Might as well take some pictures while it's nice, because in Ottawa that doesn't last. Especially in November, it was quite odd. So yeah, it was just something I was just trying to honestly just generate discussion. I try to do that from time to time, even if I don't necessarily agree with it, or even that's my opinion. It's just usually what I try to go with. And one of the things I think today, and kind of why I was really excited where you wanted to bring in different countries' experiences, because to me, and not just me, but all historians, I think, should know that context is the most important thing almost entirely when we're doing what we're doing. And I just think sometimes that gets lost with memorials, especially, and especially this one. It's got a fraught history. I mean, a lot of people know about the fraught history of the Vimy Memorial, how long that took, all the problems with it. The National Memorial has its own problems as well in that regard. It took a long time to get done. There was a big fight about even putting the Second World War numbers on there, which took until the 1980s. Like, that is just forgotten. And the South African ones weren't added until 2014. To me, I just can't get over that is when those went up. Those went up in the same ceremony as the numbers for Afghanistan. It's just, I can't get over that that's what happened, because like, people have brought up, it's the heritage thing. I'm like, well, is heritage 8 years old? It just, to me, it doesn't quite work in that sense. But again, I'm just more interested to hear what you have to think about the context of these things and how they go. I mean, and this is said over and over again, but memorials and statues, they reflect the time they were put up, not necessarily the time that they're, supposed to be representing in just kind of a basic artistic form or in a plaque or whatever. I tend to think that that gets forgotten, especially with this one. And like you said, it's such a fraught emotional subject. It's sometimes hard to clear out all the noise and focus on that, because that's, I guess, what I was trying to do. I was trying to, I guess, sort of not in the, being a little too optimistic, which is rare for me, but, kind of, see if we can just cut through that in the week leading up to Remembrance Day when we can talk about this stuff, because I know it gets super charged. But I mean, it's an interesting way of thinking about it to me. So I don't know, maybe other countries could provide some sort of understanding for us, especially when you mentioned South Africa itself, because I know very little about how these things are viewed in South Africa.
Yeah, I'm very privileged. One of my research projects a few years ago for a book on disease prevention, actually, that was delayed, ironically, by the pandemic, and will be my first stop once I get down to Australia to finish this up. Was I got to travel a lot, and I got to go down to South Africa and got to spend a lot of time in Australia and New Zealand as this. So I do comparative history really speaks to me, and I think that taking a look at what some of the other countries that Canada is related to, strategic cousins, I believe, is one of the terms that has been used is not necessarily siblings, but coming from the same roots and having some of the same experiences. Looking at how remembrance is different in these different countries, I think really throws into stark relief what some of the features of our own remembrance are, because we, as you said, we take it for granted. We take it as like a basic set of assumptions that this is how we remember war, and that this is the proper way to remember war, and any other way to remember it is improper. And that's not true. These things serve different purposes and have a very different texture, very different flavor, if you will, across the different Commonwealth countries, and even within Canada. I mean, if you look at how the First World War is remembered in Newfoundland, I think it's remembered very differently than it is anywhere else. And Quebec as well has its own differences that are where the trauma, the national trauma of conscription, in some ways outweighs the historical memory of the sacrifice of the First World War on the battlefield, and so that that plays a much heavier role within Quebecois culture than it does anywhere else. But internationally, there's a lot of there's some really key differences, I think, in how we remember across the different Commonwealth countries. And I think if you want to talk a little bit about that, I'd be happy to.
I do. I mean, I always like to, because again, I haven't traveled as extensively as you within the former Dominions. I've only been to Britain, and it's funny because I can't not think about these things as a historian, right? We try to shut our brains off sometimes, and we just can't.
Doesn't work.
It's impossible almost. Because I was there in 2018, right, for the end, the centenary for the end, and I wasn't sure what I wanted to do, and I knew down at the the cenotaph at Whitehall was going to be just a madness. So I said, let's go to a local one in the area that I'd stayed in, and I'd stayed there before, so I kind of got to know the community a little bit, and it was so striking to me how similar it was, how almost identical it was, but also how different it was. I mean, it just hit me in a different way. So I was just thinking, is there, in that way, is that any major differences kind of stuck out to you? I mean, we were already discussing before how Australia has kind of a different focus depending, based on their own history. But is there any other ones that really have stuck out to you as a difference?
Yeah, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa all have, in my opinion anyway, have wildly different focuses for their remembrance than Canada. I think Canada is much closer to Britain. And there's some historical reasons for that. I would suggest, again, not a historian of memory. I'm in some ways I'm kind of talking out of my ass on these topics, but these are my observations that I've and thoughts. If we want to take a look at like what a lot of I'll use the example of Canada to start with, and think about what some of the focuses of our war memory are. Vimy Ridge immediately comes to mind, and the monument there. But on the 9th of April, 1917, the four Canadian Corps divisions go surging forward to take this piece of high ground from the Germans, and this becomes one of the major centerpieces of our memory. It was an important moment of distinction for Canada. It received international attention in large part because it was the only success in an otherwise utter failure of a spring 1917 campaign on the part of the Allies. There was some religious significance because it was on Easter Sunday. There's 10,000 killed and wounded on the Canadian side in a few days of fighting, and in the aftermath of the war, that's where we elected to place the national memorial, and it was there was I believe it was Major Alexander Ross, who was later the president of the Canadian Legion, but at the time was leading one of the battalions at Vimy, who was writing about that battle being the birth of a nation. And I think that is the Vimy experience was very emblematic of how Canada likes to remember its wars. We remember them as loss. We remember them as sacrifice. Certainly, that is a heavy theme within it. If you look at the Vimy Monument, it's the loss and sacrifice are there. It is a monument about sadness. On the other hand, it's also built on top of the hill that is most associated with Canadian victory. So there's a certain triumphalism. Excuse my daughter in the background there.
Cameo appearance.
Cameo appearance. Yes, this is my daughter Posey. She'll be joining us occasionally in the background. And it is the Canadian historical experience of the First World War, of almost all wars, is one that we associate largely with triumph. And there are exceptions. I'm thinking Dieppe and Hong Kong, but they are very small in the grand scheme of Canadian military histories. We are usually not only not only see ourselves as being on the side of the angels, but we see ourselves as being on the side of the winners. And that is, I think that is a very important distinction in how that shapes our memory in comparison, especially in comparison with Australia, New Zealand, Newfoundland. It is where the texture of it is very different and focused upon is focused upon loss and sacrifice as well, but also things like betrayal, incompetence, being dragged into an imperial war for no particular good reason. And that's hard to grapple with. And it's not something we grapple with as much in Canada. And that was why I thought that your discussion of the South African war dates on the cenotaph was a really interesting one, because that we're on the winning side in that war, but I think we can there's an unspoken conflation of the winning side being the good side in Canada. Right. And often that's true. Second World War, Korea, these are wars against aggression. These are wars that they're kind of straight cut and dry instances of trying to oppose international aggression. First World War, the bookshelves groan under the weight of books that have been written on the topic of like who's to blame and why and that it's sort of a tortured subject, a little more problematic there about like, was this a good war or not? But you can make a case either way for it. South Africa, no, probably. I mean, in hindsight, even at the time, is looking pretty bad. And I think that question then of like, does that belong on the cenotaph? That's a wonderful kind of way to examine some of the underlying assumptions of like that unspoken current of triumphalism, I think, in Canadian memory and in Canadian remembrance, is that we lost, we sacrificed. It was a tragedy in many ways, but we still won. Right. And that like we're still on the side of the victors. We don't have to question, or we don't usually question, was it a good war? Was the cause worth fighting for? Was this was it worth the sacrifice? I don't know. I don't see nearly as much discussion of that within Canadian circles as I do. It's kind of baked into to the discussions in Australia and New Zealand, where the
Right.
focuses are on things like the Gallipoli campaign in particular, and their war memory is based upon loss, sacrifice, mass butchery, British incompetence, being kind of dragged along by your teeth into a series of misadventures that you were, kind of beyond your control, and were your soldiers were butchered for. That's true in the first of their memory of the First World War and the Second World War. If you ever have the chance to take a look at the Australian War Memorial in Canberra, which is a absolutely magnificent building, and the museum that is inside pays I would say, in comparison to Canada, a disproportionate amount of attention to the defeats, to things like Gallipoli, to Singapore, to the some of the battles in North Africa that were disasters for the Australians or for the New Zealanders, for the prisoner of war experience, for the tortures of the Far East. This is, I think, that has a lot of bearing on what they are remembering. Becomes a real focus that we kind of lack in Canada. That's my sorry. I'm just kind of talking. No,
go ahead. Sorry, I just had someone writing something horrible, and I just caught it.
Yeah, I saw that. That was
that was quick.
So give them the boot and carry on.
Oh yeah, they're gone forever. Anyway, sorry. Yeah, I think you're right. In a lot of ways, I mean, I have kind of a different way of kind of looking at it than myself. I mean, my dissertation was on Hong Kong completely and about the memory of it. So I kind of consider myself like a memory historian in a way, because I did a lot of work with that. And again, what you're saying is so interesting to me, because the Australians will talk about it and will look at it and will kind of dig at that. I mean, I literally used a book. It was called Zombie Myths, which got me in a little trouble with my dissertation committee because I used the same term, and they're like, "That's not academic." I'm like, "Okay, whatever." I'm like, anyway, the Australians disagree because every top historian at the time is written in this book. So clearly they're okay with the use, but that's neither here nor there. But that's what they looked at. They looked at all of them. They covered the gambit from, I think it started in, well, it starts with, the Europeans showing up, and then right through, I think, until, I can't remember exactly, maybe Vietnam. A whole bunch of myths. I mean, Gallipoli's part of that, but also South Africa was part of that. And about that, and kind of the same sort of way we think about it in a different way, depending on who you're talking to. And this is why South Africa is so interesting to me, because there's so many parallels in how it's viewed, but also how it's not. Because the one that sticks out to me is a lot of Canadians and Americans probably don't know the story. There was a movie about it, but Breaker Mormont was one of the big ones that was discussed in that book. And he was charged with war crimes and all of that stuff. And it basically came down to, on some side, saying, well, the British made us like this. It's the British fault that we were doing this because that's what they told us to do. And I went, that's okay. That's odd. And that's kind of how I think about South Africa in a way. And also, it's just, they made us do this, or it's policy. That was the one that kind of bothered me the most, because it was just a lack of context. That's what bothers me. And coming back to that whole discussion on Twitter, right, they were, soldiers don't carry out policy, or they carry out policy, they don't get a say. And I went, that is literally not true for South Africa. No one was sent there against their will, right? They literally had to send volunteer battalions only, because it was causing such a political storm here at home with Prime Minister, Laurier, who clearly knew what he was doing in terms of balancing, the French and English aspects at the time that dominated Canadian politics.
Yeah, they could not send a formed Canadian unit of the militia or the permanent force or anything to South Africa. Yeah, had to. Many of the militiamen at the time volunteered.
Yes,
but you had to create a whole new entity to send. That's absolutely true.
And why I wanted to bring that up too is because, and I get that, I understand that soldiers don't, sometimes it gets a little murky. Sometimes soldiers, yes, do make policy. So again, that's just not true in every instance. But I get that. I understand that. I understand what people were trying to say. I understand that. I wasn't arguing that point, but I'm just saying in that context, it's just not true. But why that's so interesting to me is because it's how we think about these things. Like you already said, like that goes down to the root. And that's always how I've been trying to do this, because my dissertation, not to toot my own horn, just how I think about these things is.
It's your show, Brad. You toot that horn. You toot that horn.
It was just because Hong Kong, all the literature and everything around it was so poorly done from, historical rigor and all of that. I was like, okay, I got to go down to the roots of this. Where does this come from? I mean, that again got me in a little trouble with the dissertation committee, but I was like, what else can I do? Right? This is so bad. I think it needs to be redone. And that's what I was trying to do, is why do we think like this? So I guess that's kind of what I always do now, is why are we thinking like this? Why does say someone question, not even questioning, raising a question about, literally two numbers being on some granite cause such a reaction? And that's kind of what I was trying to understand, or trying to get people to think about, not in one way or the other, just why is that the way we go about it? And again, why I think a comparative is so interesting is because, like you already said, we're that same sort of the cousins, or the same sort of family, sort of connected in a way, some similar traditions, similar roots, sort of. Again, each nation has a different element, influencing that. But it's just something I don't know. It's just these things I think we take for granted, and how these things go. And I wanted to kind of expand that a little bit by looking at some different examples. And I think. And I think
my son Montgomery,
he's back.
He's back. Yeah.
And because I think expanding and looking at different nations is a good way of doing that, because it kind of gets us out of our own headspace, and I think we do that a lot in Canada. So I wanted to kind of hear more maybe about the Gallipoli aspect, because.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Let's talk about that. Because there's Hong Kong, I think, is probably, and maybe Dieppe, are the closest to some kind of reckoning with Gallipoli that Canada has.
Yes.
Outside of Newfoundland. We'll leave that aside and say Newfoundlanders have a lot of Newfoundlanders. I think share a lot of their characteristics of war memory with the Australians and. Hi, Monty. And
he's already got some fans.
But I'll take a brief aside. The reason his name is Monty is that when we lived in Kingston until very recently, we lived on Alamein Drive, and I absolutely could not resist when we had a son the chance to name him Montgomery of Alamein. So that's I'll throw that out there just to as my nerd credentials for the day. So the Australian war memory generally exists on a different scale from Canadian war memory, and without throwing aspersions out on our very fine museum and cultural institutions, our war memory is not anywhere near as imposing or as institutionalized in society as it is, particularly for the Australians. Their war memorial in Canberra is in the capital city is magnificent, in part because the city was largely built around the memorial, so that their parliament buildings are constructed to be perfectly geometrically aligned with the war memorial. The prime minister is supposed to look up from his or her desk out the window on a straight line down Anzac Parade to the front doors of the memorial several kilometers away. And it actually works. And likewise, if you stand at the gates of the memorial and look down, it's a straight shot right down to the prime minister's office in Parliament. The edifice is huge. It is impressive. It combines their war museum, their national war memorial, their tomb of the unknown soldier, their wall of remembrance, and their military archives all in one. So I spent a lot of time there because that's where the military archives were, and it is one of the most one of the most incredible places for a historian to work in the world. But they have it's not only that, they have war memorials in all of their state capitals as well, in Sydney and Melbourne, that are almost as imposing and grand as the one in Canberra. The one in New South Wales, in Hyde Park in downtown Sydney, has at the center is a statue of an Australian soldier crucified on a sword and shield, bringing to behind, both sacrifice and crucifixion of Christ, and that old caution given to ancient Spartan warriors of return with your shield or upon it.
Yeah.
And so like there's layers to this stuff. And we don't have commemorative sites here in Canada on this scale. The closest we have is the Vimy Memorial, which is not in Canada. The Australians and the New Zealanders elected to keep their repositories of war memory much closer to home. And there are a lot of differences carved into those stones, because what is being remembered is quite different. The central to both the war memory in both Australia and New Zealand is the idea of is the word Anzac, which originally the name was the combined Australian and New Zealand Army Corps formation that all troops from the Antipodes served in early in the First World War. Its significance grew much greater on one wall of the war memorial in Melbourne. There's an explanation of what Anzac is supposed to represent to the people of Australia. In fact, it's a protected term in the federal legislation of Australia. To keep it from being commercialized, no one is allowed to use it for commercial purposes except the government, and they do. There was something like on the 100th anniversary of Anzac Day in 2015, I believe there was something like $600 million spent on commemoration throughout the country, just by the government, to say nothing of other corporate sponsorships. Anyway, the qualities of Anzac that were laid out in the war memorial were loss, courage, the endurance of dreadful odds, and that seems to embody the qualities that Australians and New Zealanders really want to see in the idea of who an Anzac is. They are all qualities of character. None of them imply victory. And in the Anzac, because the Anzac tradition is really one of their narrative is a war memory born out of defeat rather than out of victory. I mean, like in the bigger scheme of the war, like ultimately won the war, but what they focus on is stuff like Gallipoli. And for those who aren't aware, the Gallipoli campaign was an early attempt in the First World War by the Allies to knock Turkey or the Ottoman Empire out of the war with a naval and amphibious assault on the Gallipoli Peninsula at the mouth of the Dardanelles Straits that link the Aegean Sea to the Black Sea, very, very close to what was then Constantinople, is now Istanbul, the capital of the Ottoman state. This was the first combat experience for the Anzac Corps. Was landed on a thin stretch of beach that very, very quickly stops being beach and leads up to towering cliff heights called Anzac Cove. And Gallipoli was a fiasco. It was an absolutely disaster. It was poorly planned. It was badly executed. The landings were fiercely opposed from the Turks by the start. It was one of the only times when the Turks, who were generally got kicked around in the First World War a lot, it was the only time they actually displayed real combat effectiveness was in Gallipoli. And they turned what was supposed to be a decapitation strike turned into a hellish trench stalemate out in the Mediterranean sun. And after fighting it out for indecisively on the peninsula for 8 months, the Allies had to withdraw. And the only thing that could be said to be successful about the Gallipoli campaign was the withdrawal of troops at the end actually worked like clockwork, and they managed to get all of the survivors out without the Turks realizing that's what they were doing. And that was the only good thing about that entire campaign. They left behind some 10,000 Australian and New Zealand dead, another 20,000 wounded for absolutely no gain. And this is one of this is one of the most, it was far from the most important contribution that Australia and New Zealand made to the First World War. It was not the most violent or costly battle that their soldiers participated in. They were fighting alongside the Canadian Corps in the final 100 days of the First World War and accomplished just as much. There were other elements of the history of that war that could have been the focus of their war memory, but it is the view that has become mythologized in Australia and New Zealand as emblematic of the war efforts of both of those nations is Gallipoli. And Gallipoli is loss, it is torment, it is sacrifice, it is defeat. And in probably the most notable departure from Canada, it is also betrayal, because in the popular view of Gallipoli, the strapping young soldiers of Australia and New Zealand were led to the slaughter by British command and incompetence, and that's really a recurring theme. The Gallipoli campaign kind of implanted a national myth of Australian lives being sacrificed and squandered for the benefit of others in conflicts that were not really directly relevant to Australian national interests. And if we kind of take a step back from that and think of like that is what the crux of their war memory is. And there is no parallel, again, outside of Newfoundland, there is no parallel with how we remember the First World War with that in Canada. For all that we talk about loss and sacrifice, that sense of betrayal, or the sense that we were that our soldiers were not fighting for a good cause, is usually completely absent.
Right.
So I think that's one of the most notable differences between the countries and war memory right there. It'd be difficult for it to be more different.
Yeah, I think that's key. I mean, I did a live stream, I don't even know how long ago now, about kind of how, not necessarily just a Canadian focus in the sense, but sometimes how defeat can really be viewed as a central part of understanding military history, particularly, I think, for some reason, some English-speaking countries, and I mean just not even, the former dominions or the empire, even United States in a lot of ways. It's interesting. And again, like I told you earlier, we have a lot of American viewers. And sorry, I didn't want to bring this up too already, but Vietnam keeps coming to mind. Can't not, in sense of Australia too, right? Because they're involved in that conflict. We're not. Another defeat, another loss. It only comes up to mind because, again, like I said, we have American viewers, and Susan, who's in the U.S., brought up the Vietnam War Memorial, and that one's an interesting one. It's been controversial for all kinds of reasons. It contains the names of all of those killed. It's got several other parts to it, which most people don't know who haven't been there. It just comes to mind because, and again, I keep coming back to what we frame this around, the national memorial here, and what's being remembered. I think, and again, hopefully I'm not speaking out of turn because I don't know the Australian context very well, but I had Alexandria McKinnon on, who I was telling you about, who worked Canadian, Australian. She had lots of great insights because she's, as I like to say, for some people, they're from everywhere. She's one of those people who's from everywhere. And she talked about how the names are preserved at the War Memorial in Australia. Yep. We have that, but not in Canada. Right. No, it's only on the Menin Gate and other parts and Vimy. And that's it. We don't have that here in this country at all. Like, we have some small cenotaphs that do that. That's mostly sort of a First World War thing, a little bit second. That's another controversial thing because some didn't want to have the second as well, which is something in context we don't talk about, but we can maybe discuss that later. But to me, I find that so interesting that we kind of have a national lack of that. And I don't know if that's because we want to focus on, like you already said, the victories, the winning, the being on the good side. I don't know why that is. And it's just something that keeps coming up to me, is remembering, say, individuals, which we don't do in Canada specifically. Literally, I'm like physically, like I just said, but and whereas we kind of do overseas, but we're kind of piggybacking off kind of what was going to happen anyway. Whereas the Australians do that. I don't know if the New Zealanders have an equivalent, but it's just something that sticks out.
The New Zealand's as with everything with New Zealand, I found New Zealand is always a little more muted in comparison to Australia, and they have there's some wonderful war memorials and some wonderful sites. Not quite as, I don't want to say over the top, but not quite as imposing as like the Australian War Memorial, but they have some very, very beautiful ones, and they have their memory of their national war memorial is in Wellington, their capital. Much more restrained, but it's still their war memorial and museum is built on a hill. It has a commanding view of the entire city. It combines memorial, Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, museum, national carillon. Their memorial's carillon is actually the sister instrument to the Peace Tower bells in Ottawa. And they have I believe they have books of remembrance as well that are kept at that site, that are if not engraved in stone. I can't remember if they actually have all of the names of the lost, engaged in or the fallen engraved in stone, the way that the Australians do.
Right.
One of the things that I remember from my last visits there was that at their national museum, which is called Te Papa, which is just down the hill from the War Museum, from the War Memorial.
Right.
They had a massive exhibit on Gallipoli called "The Scale of Our War," and this was over the top. This was co-created by Peter Jackson of Lord of the Rings fame, and his Weta Workshop did all of the special effects. And the centerpieces of this interactive exhibit were a dozen larger-than-life models of New Zealand soldiers at Gallipoli, each one 2.5 times life size. They were meticulously crafted, like obsessive in their level of research and detail for the making of the uniforms, the materials that were used, the accuracy of all of the little details there, and it's both literally and metaphorically larger than life, because in that exhibit, which was wildly popular. I believe it's still up. It was there when I visited in 2020, just before the lockdown started.
Yeah.
The curators also openly discuss how 85% of the New Zealanders deployed to Gallipoli were killed or wounded, and this is a number that has been largely internalized in the country, which New Zealand historians, have shown to actually be in deep error, because it doesn't really account for like how troops were rotated, and it's part of the national myth, but it actually has like very little grounding in reality. But it occurred to me that the loss, that betrayal, and those, the motif of resilience were being cast in New Zealand as mythological, as like literally something out of a Tolkien heroic fantasy.
Yeah.
That was, and I think that speaks to what Stephen Page, hey Stephen, in the comments there is talking about the heroic sacrifice paradigm. I think that is like, I think that plays a very large role in the story, the narrative of Gallipoli in particular. Right. Others as well, Singapore, if you want to get into the Second World War, for the Australians, where they lose a division for not very good reasons, in the defense of Malaya and Singapore, and that is often mentioned in much the same breath. And in Australian war memory, it's really interesting stuff.
Yeah, I mean, to me it's fascinating, and because I looked at this for, as well, you did a doctorate, you know how these things go. You just over obsess, and you dig and you dig and you dig and you dig, and then you dig a little more. Just finding those comparisons, and obviously I couldn't escape Singapore. Looking at Hong Kong is impossible. It came up almost literally in searches. It would just show up.
Oh yeah.
But how they're twinned, right? In that way, and in Canada, they're Hong Kong and Dieppe are twinned, right? They're 8 months apart, roughly. Not quite the same, but they're twinned in that way. And then we just kind of move on, and then it's Sicily for a little bit, and then hey, Normandy. But like again, that's the difference in Canada. But to me, it's just so fascinating how these things about resilience keep coming up. That's the one I think that sticks out to me. I mean, and again, I think, I don't know the New Zealand context as well, but the Australian, the idea of mateship is big. That's discussed in almost any article I read about Gallipoli and its memory. But those are the things, and maybe if you might have a different opinion than I do, but I think those are missing in the Canadian way of looking at this. We look at the resilience of when we win. When we lose, it's somebody else's fault. And or for whatever reason there's something else going on, or that something was wrong, or the moon phases threw everybody off or something. We always find a ridiculous excuse in some way. But and why I bring that up is because, again, like the context of how Australia remembers the war, how New Zealand remembers the war is different in that sense of, we see this as they take something positive from the jaws of defeat, and so does the Americans, and not just world wars, right? You have Alamo and all that stuff. Literally, remember, the Alamo was repeated over and over again for having the same sort of thing. And in Canada, we don't do that. I don't know. Again, I'm not really sure why. I couldn't really get a full answer.
I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that we're usually on the winning side. I mean, like the First World War, I can't think of a battle that the Canadians were involved with that like we were really on the losing side.
Not
I
really.
mean, maybe in 1915, like, you know, really, but even then, it's not really. I mean, the Canadians were used in such a way that we're usually and the only time that they really when after the Canadians went into the line after 1915, when they're in the where they're having to deal with a German offensive, it doesn't hit the Canadians at all. They're you know, they're hanging out around Lawns and Hill 70 and Vimy at that point, holding the ground, and the Germans never come at them, because why would you attack Vimy Ridge if you can go around it? Like, that's especially from the coming from the east. There's really not a lot of point to it. So
sorry, I got to jump in because everyone thinks they're coming from the west is terrible. I'm like, you haven't looked at the east, have you?
No. The east is the east is bad.
Anyway,
bad. It's what you're saying about resilience and the differences of memory. I think just to shout out to Susan, who was talking about the Vietnam War Memorial in the States. Vietnam is remembered very differently in Australia than it is in the United States. There's a whole exhibit and gallery within the Australian War Memorial on Australia's participation in Vietnam, because unlike Canada, which sent 30,000 soldiers but had no actual involvement from the Canadian government in Vietnam, Australia did send troops to Vietnam, like in Australian uniforms, and they were formally involved in the Vietnam War. And that is not seen as anywhere near as big a disaster or a that seems to, and I might be wrong about this, because I've again, this is impressions from Rob wandering around museums and reading a few books and trying and talking with Australians rather than a systematic historical study of this. But it doesn't, that sense of regret and loss and betrayal is really missing, ironically, from the Australian Vietnam experience. I think in part because Australia accomplished its objectives in Vietnam, which was staying close with the United States, like fighting this war because the Americans wanted that war fought, and the Australians put up their hands and volunteered and got in there and did what they could, and they suffered losses, but it wasn't catastrophic losses, and it's certainly, I think that there's some contention in Australian society about Vietnam, but it's not a major point of it's not one of those inflection points like Gallipoli or Singapore or any sort of involvement like that. I think it's again, I don't want to see it was done in a transactional sense, but I think that Australia's interests were certainly fulfilled by participating in Vietnam, and that might be self-evident.
Yeah, I mean, well, sorry, just got made an interesting point here. Who's also in the U.S. With Canadian connections. Scott's one of our best supporters here at the channel. That's interesting too, thinking about it in that way. Yeah, transactional. I don't know if that's the right word, but I understand completely what you're saying in that sense.
It's probably not the right word.
Probably not. I'm sure there's some word for it, especially with the international relations scholars. They like to sometimes.
Actually, I'm pretty sure the international relations scholars would refer to it as transactional.
Probably.
I've been reading international relations papers for the Australian War College lately, so that's where if I'm coming in through a little IR, if there's a little IR talk coming through, that's I will blame it on that.
I'll say I don't envy you. That's all I'll say. No, it's so interesting in that sense of how some of these things are understood. I don't know. Maybe that has to do with how people understand conflicts and what they mean or what they're fought for. I don't know. I mean, the questions, and I think this goes back to Stephen's question about that sacrifice, right? And I can't not think of Jonathan Vance's book on the First World War, Death So Noble. And his idea was how they remember the war at the time, right after or right at the end, and then kind of leading into the 1920s, is extremely different than how most people would think about the First World War at the time he was writing in the late 20th century and even into today. I can't move past that because the idea of sacrifice comes up sacrificing
And the idea
myself.
of triumph, that was what got
Yeah,
the death so noble, was what really
yeah,
got me thinking about the differences there.
yeah,
Was that one of Vance's central arguments was that the spirit of triumphalism infused
yes,
Canadian war memory early on, and it has kind of lost the explicit tones of that, but I think that it's still there implicitly.
okay,
And
yeah,
it's perhaps one of the unspoken qualities of Canadian war memory, that we are not only on the side of the winners, but we're also on the side of the good guys, right?
yeah,
We're the guns, and that takes us back to why South Africa and the Northwest Rebellion in 1885 are like really problematic to have on the cenotaph,
yeah.
or potentially problematic, or at least worth having a discussion about.
Yeah, I mean, it's just to discuss and exchange some ideas and have why live streams are amazing. Have people literally doing it input
Yeah.
while we're doing this. It's not afterwards where you're just typing out comments. This is literally as we're going and why I like doing this way. But it is in that sense, well, how I think about it in terms of how these things change and move, and what memorials mean and who they mean, what they mean, sorry, what they mean to different individuals, but also time periods. I can't, against the context thing, I can't get away from it.
Yeah.
What they
Let,
mean at the time can change, right?
if I can, you asked about like the South African experience
Yeah,
of not just the South African War, but the experience of South
yeah,
Africa as a country with war memory. Um, I think that South Africa is a really good example of historical memory as a component of national identity, and how it can be really fragile, and how those meanings can shift and break down
right.
and completely reverse themselves over time. And South Africa is a really good country for that. It is, as I said earlier, it's a country that with a rich, layered, and very tortured national history. It was in if we look back at the First World War, the Union of South Africa was the was the youngest. It was the least
Yeah,
stable of the British dominions in 1914. It had been forcibly pacified as a result of the South African War only about a decade earlier. That forcibly merged a series of predominantly English-speaking Cape and Natal colonies that were merged with the Dutch-speaking, fiercely independent Afrikaner republics of the Transvaal and the Orange Free State, and they were variously antagonistic and cooperative, but both of the white populations lived in a state of privilege above a
mm,
huge disenfranchised black population of the country. As a British Dominion, South Africa sent troops to the First World War, largely, but not entirely exclusively, drawn from the English-speaking parts of the country. In part because one of the very first actions of the First World War was an Afrikaner rebellion against British rule in South
mhm,
Africa that had to be put down before the South Africans or the South African government troops could do anything else. Their main effort was against the German colonies in southern Africa, but they also sent an infantry brigade to the Western Front in 1916.
mhm,
There they fought at the Battle of the Somme, more specifically a place along the line called Delville Wood. And the South Africans took and held Delville Wood against German counterattack. Almost 80% of the South African soldiers committed to the action were killed or wounded during that battle. And although the South African, the Springboks, as they were referred to, kind of like Tommies or Anzacs, they would go on to fight in several other major battles. Delville Wood became the natural focus of South African commemoration. The grounds of that battlefield were gifted to South Africa after the war, much as Vimy Ridge was gifted to Canada. A memorial was originally constructed there, officially unveiled in 1926. Fairly small. A centerpiece was a bronze statue of two men and a war horse with inscriptions in English and Dutch, or Afrikaans, and the two men in the statue represented the two white races of South Africa at the time, the English and the Afrikaners. There were three copies of the statue. One was in Delville Wood, one was in a public garden in Cape Town, and one was put up right outside the Parliament of South Africa in the capital of Pretoria. They don't have the imposing grandeur, but they kind of link the battlefield to the homeland in different ways. But the really fascinating thing was that the sacrifices at Delville Wood made a really useful rallying point. And there were
mm,
were highly constructed because it was a rallying point for national unity for the British aligned party that controlled the government during the two world wars and much of the interwar years. This is the party of Jan Smuts, who wanted to reconcile English and Afrikaners. Yep, Stephen's already ahead of me on that one.
Yeah, he's ahead of us.
And they intended to use the sacrifice and the accomplishment of Delville Wood as kind of a focus for reconciliation.
Yep.
But after the Second World War, which was not a prime moment of national unity in South Africa either, in 1948, an Afrikaner nationalist party won control of the South African government on the promise to implement a strict policy of racial segregation, what became known as apartheid. And the Afrikaner nationalists would govern South Africa for the next 40 years. And the emphasis in war memory moved to the Afrikaner cultural experience, the settlement of the interior of South Africa, the Anglo-Afrikaner Wars, and the Afrikaner rebellion against the British at the beginning of the First World War. So the military achievements, the legacy, the meaning of the First and Second World Wars, as were broadly understood in a global context, were largely sidelined, even as the soldiers who had fought in those wars were shuffled out of positions of authority, even within the military, very, very quickly. In 1952, the nationalist government installed what's called a Voortrekker cross, which is a symbol of Afrikaner nationalism. And they installed this at the site of the memorial in France. The Voortrekker cross is supposed to bear witness to the Afrikaners' great trek across the continent across the country in South Africa in 1836, and of the wars fought by the Afrikaners against British colonialism and quote African savagery. And by adding the Voortrekker cross at Delville Wood, the nationalists were kind of superseding the monument's original intention, and toting Dutch triumphalism over previous emphasis on national unity. But it keeps spinning around again, because by the 1980s, South Africa was in real trouble. At the height of apartheid, South Africa had become an international pariah, and the nationalist government, which was then isolated from most parts of the world and under siege from international pressure, invested a lot of money in building a commemorative museum to South African military history on the grounds of Delville Wood in France. It was in the shape of the Castle of Good Hope in Cape Town, which is really the heart of white English-speaking South Africa. And it is kind of a none too subtle gesture to try and curry favor and unite the country's white electorate at a time of intense crisis and turmoil, and to reach out to former international partners that were now shunning the country, as saying that we have this common heritage of having fought and sacrificed in this war together. Right. And then in the post-apartheid era of South Africa, after the end of white dominance in the country and the extending of the vote to all citizens of South Africa, the memory of Delville Wood is being kind of remobilized again. A few years ago, for the 100th anniversary of the battle, the museum in France got a full restoration, full redesign. South Africa's then president Jacob Zuma was on site for a rededication. And the new focus for the commemoration of Delville Wood was on all South Africans, particularly Black and colored South Africans, who colored being an actual category of person in South Africa, for those who aren't aware. For those who served in labor units during the war, rather than just focus on the all-white combat forces, which is to that point had been the exclusive nexus of memory within that memorial. So in a country that was really struggling to reconcile its racial tensions in that post-apartheid era, South Africa was probably unlikely to ever look again at Delville Wood as a symbol of national identity. It's still commemorated, but it's not a popularly recognized symbol of modern South Africa. Again, I would argue will probably never be so. It doesn't really speak to where South Africa is now as a country, but like the journey that commemoration and that remembrance took, where it started, kind of that tortured little vein that it followed all the way to today is really interesting. And I think it speaks to how war memory and remembrance can easily be constructed, and how there's often political purposes behind remembrance that deserve some further interrogation.
Yeah. I mean, again, just give you a break there, but I mean, I agree. And then that again, it keeps coming back to South African in the numbers and the memorial here. Ottawa. It's the same sort of thing. I wasn't trying to offend anyone. If people were,
no.
Some people were offended. They told me they were offended, and I went, okay, well, sorry. Actually, I didn't apologize because I don't think I did anything wrong in that sense.
No, I agree that these are questions that ought to be asked.
Yeah, exactly.
The idea that should we strip the dates, the 1899 dates off of the war memorial? I mean, that takes us back to the question of what is it there for? Are we there to commemorate those who lost their lives pursuing Canada's policy interests? In that case, well, you can put it either way. Either it belongs there, or we should take all of the dates off of it, because those who gave their lives for Canada's policy interests were not limited to the wars, and if we start putting specific wars in there, then we start getting some really uncomfortable questions about those wars, and I think we should get into those uncomfortable questions. We should interrogate the place of the South African War in Canadian memory. We should interrogate the place of the Northwest War in 1885 in Canadian memory too, because which is also something that we're really not going to do, because that's Canada's war. I won't say war of extermination, but a almost completely unjustified war that was fought largely so that we could so that white Canada could renege on its treaty obligations to its First Nations people, is not shine a particularly good light on us. But that was Canadian policy. Like that was, and those, if we want to make categories like that, there's going to be troubled questions. And I think that we should absolutely ask these questions. It's not that neither you nor I, Brad, has the power to strip any dates or anything off of the the war memorial, nor do I think would either of us ever advocate for that. But I think that the questions it raises of why are specific dates on there in the first place is a really powerful one. And you mentioned that there was a tremendous amount of resistance back in probably the 1950s to putting the dates for the Second World War on the cenotaph at all, because it was supposed to be at that time, probably the Legion, dominated by First World War veterans, were saying, well, no, this is ours, go get your own. And so that's another aspect of war memory that I think.
Yeah, well, that's why I think, and again, the context again, but that one is so fascinating to me, is because again, well, and Scott asked a really interesting question. I kind of want to lead into that with this, but Tim Cook talked about this expertly, as he does with everything he writes about. But in his book, The Fight for History, about the memory of the Second World War, they wanted a separate memorial for the Second World War. They wanted to leave what is now the National War Memorial for the First World War in where it is, leave it alone. They wanted to build another one. For all kinds of reasons, that didn't happen. It's not so cut and dry, but there was a debate about that, about putting those numbers on. There was a debate about letting Second World War veterans into the Legion in the first place. Like, that gets forgotten completely. Like, these vets were not supporting each other. So I mean,
they did not let Canadian conscripts
in either at the beginning. They eventually did.
Yeah,
it took a long time. Eventually,
it took a very long time, and that was a hill that a lot of people were prepared to die on.
Oh yeah,
was that if you had not volunteered yourself, if you'd not signed on the dotted line of your own free will, that you are not going to be welcome.
Yeah, well, I've heard there's literally stories where they kick them out of the building, like not even just literally signing a card to get in, literally out of the building. Anyway, that's a whole other. We could probably talk about that for another 4 hours, but that's a whole. That one's a big rabbit hole there. But anyway, it's why this is so interesting to me is interpretation, what it means, what it's meant in the past. I think it's just so complicated, and sometimes we take too simplistic of a view. And then the thing that to me is that when the people get offended, or they think I'm trying to be offensive, or historians are trying to be offensive, and that's not what's happening here. Just trying to understand what's going on and why things are the way they are. Like you already said, I'm not advocating taking them off. I don't think a lot of people knew the context of how they even got up there in the first place, right? I think
well, it's really important. I don't know. I think I think part of why people are offended by it now is because there's something in the air about, the taking down of statues
Exactly.
and taking down the names of people who are associated with the slave trade or with the residential schools in Canada and the obliteration of First Nations culture. The and there, I think there's sort of this desire to dig in, to reinforce to treat commemoration as something that is that should be unproblematic, that should be universal,
Right.
that should be understood as a as common sense. As a, well, of course, it's about supporting the troops. It's about respecting the troops. If you if you call for any kind of change to a memorial, then you are disrespecting history and disrespecting the troops. Which I don't think it's at all disrespectful to the troops. The question that you raised, or what we've been talking about here today, the acknowledgement that, and I think that's where the international context and the kind of that comparison is a valuable one, because we see that, well, no, there isn't just one way of remembering. Memory is a political construct. It like there are political undercurrents to what we're remembering and why. It isn't self-evident why we should be remembering in certain ways and what we choose to remember.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, sorry, go back but something earlier, because you brought up Vimy, as I did as well. Vimy, I have my two theories of why Vimy's there. Why sort of the National Memorial's at Vimy, because I've seen the documents, but because King, Prime Minister at the time, wanted it there because of the free land, but also because of everything that he could use that for. He didn't want to give them pensions, but he would give them a memorial that cost a lot less. No one talks about that part ever. That never gets discussed. Also, because the roads where it was originally supposed to be at Hill 62, which is Flanders, kind of boring. There was no roads. The roads were so destroyed. The salient was so bad they couldn't get there. Honestly,
but my perspective on Vimy is that you really can't get a better place, like aesthetically, for a monument. If you want, of all the Canadian battlefields, like this is almost as good as it gets, unless you want to have like one of the mountaintops in Hong Kong or something. You can't really get like a much better place to have that national monument. I think that counts for a lot. Is the pure aesthetics. But yeah, absolutely. The thing about pensions and why it was created at that time. Yeah, because at that time they were also trying to strip the pensions away from tens of thousands of Canadian soldiers who came back with shell shock, and I saw some of those documents as well, and they were working very, very hard to make sure that soldiers did not get a payday.
Yeah.
Instead, they, the fact that the memorial went up at the same time, I don't think it was a grand conspiracy or anything, but I think it was a calculated move.
100%. I already know it is. I've seen the papers. I've seen what King said.
There you go.
I've seen the diaries. I've seen because I looked at this independently in two different ways. I looked at it literally. I didn't know at the time, because I was still new grad student. I definitely wasn't young, but I didn't know, like, I wasn't plugged into the historiography as I should have been, because Tim released his book on Vimy at the same time I literally did a presentation of why is it on that hill, and I went, oh, that was a bad idea. But so I've looked at those documents from that end, and I've studied King to death. So I mean, it for dissertation purposes and other projects I've done, but it's just, I know that that's the case. So it just keeps coming up, and it comes up in such different contexts. I mean, Vimy is seen to be this great thing because of 4 divisions fighting at the same time, and it's a victory. I went, well, okay, that's all well and good.
Okay, that describes Hill 72. That describes Passchendaele. That describes,
well, I was going to say, it doesn't really
it doesn't describe. Vimy is, in my mind, Vimy is really constructed. Just because, like, it was nowhere near the most important Canadian battle. It was the accomplishment of Vimy was in my view very small in the grand strategic thing of things. Like, it was a good trial run for the Canadian Corps, if you will. It wasn't under Canadian leadership, and it wasn't. There's a fellow on Twitter who I know. I won't name him here, but he and I have been kind of kicking kicking around the idea of writing an article on why attacking Vimy Ridge was a bad idea in the first place. They probably should have done something else. In a lot of ways, I think that the attack on Hill 70 was more promising and ultimately led to better prospects for and better position for the Allies than Vimy, because you're never going to be able to attack across the Douai Plain headed eastwards. Like it was there was nowhere to go from there.
I was going to
take the high ground and that's it.
In a war of suicidal attacks, that's the biggest one they could have done.
It was.
And the picture for the thumbnail, I purposely picked that because I wanted to do, maybe I was going to try and do like you mentioned, the South African memorial. Maybe I was going to piece that together with an Australian one. I thought it's going to make it confusing and that doesn't work well for YouTube, but also because I wanted to convey that Canadian thing, because that's what I do, but also the visual, the understanding, what it is, the Britishness. I mean, it was just a perfect photo in that sense, and it just happened to be Vimy. But I completely understand what you're saying, and it's just it's so interesting how we think about things. And then again, Vimy is another minefield that I keep entering in on purpose now because I just think it's interesting. But people get offended. Like people literally told me they're offended by what I've said, and I went, I don't know how you're offended that I said other attacks were more important. Or because the 4 division thing isn't that big of a deal. Like, I mean, all 4 divisions had fought at the Somme too, but you don't know that. You know what I mean? Like, and then like you said, Hill 70, and then onwards, it's the same. Canal du Nord to me is the attack, and it's
we're in agreement there. That was far more impressive on so many levels in a way that Vimy was kind of, but it also accomplished a whole lot more.
So I mean, again, but everyone has their opinion on that, and be that as it may. But
this is if I can add a bit of a plug for my latest book, not just mine, but with fellow historian Matthew Barrett. I've recently finished a graphic history called Through Their Eyes, a graphic history of Hill 70 in the First World War. I'm second author on that. Matt is a very well-deserved first author. He's the artist who put it all together. My only art is sidewalk chalk, but his is he's a real artist and a real historian, and it is just a fantastic examination of kind of a dissection of many different parts of the Canadian experience at the Battle of Hill 70, which followed several months after Vimy Ridge. And one of the things that I end up reflecting on in the conclusion is just what qualifies as success on the Western Front, because you've at Hill 70 you also have all of the Canadian divisions involved. You've got a brilliant tactical plan, something that achieves its aim, that captures a small hill and then wipes out a staggering number of Germans who get up out of the trenches to try to counterattack it. And that's the entire point. They're trying to divert Germans away and kind of bleed them dry on the ground there. And it is hailed in the international press as a great success. It is the scale of the death, of the number of losses that the Canadians face is so far out of proportion nowadays to what we would think is like a reasonable or sane cost for anything. Is like in a few hours, in a few hours at Hill 70, there are many times the number of casualties that Canada suffered in Afghanistan, for example. Oh, Monty's back.
In the corner of the other screen,
and it is and so we have to, I think that the memory of these battles is it has to be seen through the prism of what was accomplished, and what was accomplished, like, to us looks in many ways insane, and like the margin of like what looks like a victory on the First World War in trench warfare is very very contextual. You have to think about the fact that there are hundreds of divisions on both sides that are facing each other. There are millions of soldiers on both sides. There is no good way to for them to go through each other, like or to go around each other. They have to go through each other. They have to fight it out. They have to slug it out with modern weapons. This is like it is sheer butchery to accomplish anything, even like the most elegant battle. Canal du Nord and the 100 Days, like masterworks of staff planning, of coordination, of joint or of combined warfare, I should say, and they're still the most costly battles that Canada has ever fought, and like more Canadians died there than in any battle of the Second World War, and certainly before or since. And the sheer scale of it is unbelievable. And the looking at it doesn't translate well now into memory, I guess. Sorry, I think I've kind of lost the thread of
I understand
where I
what
was
you're
trying
saying.
to go with that.
Yeah,
but
no, I understand completely.
Yeah.
Sorry, I was gonna just let me jump in there. Maybe.
Yeah, please.
And well, Monty's gone. I lost him. I lost the visual. I was watching him in the small box there. Let's make sure I didn't do anything.
There we go.
There we go. I was gonna say, because today's just been a busy day for me, as it is for a lot of historians this time of year. But there was a tweet about Passchendaele being a victory, and I went, "That's not wrong. It's not wrong." But exactly what you're talking about, scale of loss and things afterwards. I mean, they literally, when the German spring offensives happened in 1918, they literally abandoned those gains.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Which is not talked about in the context of Canada, Passchendaele. It's just so interesting that these things are seemingly forgotten in a lot of ways, are left. Sorry, you got another.
Steven's used to Monty from he was at Canadian Forces College with me last year.
Oh, that's right. No, he was telling me about that. He's been on the channel himself, so he told me about that.
Oh yeah.
And we've had Matt on the channel too. We had him talk about the book. That's what I was looking around for it. I must have put it on the proper shelf for once. But yeah, no, that book is great. So I think it's great looking at that, and Stephen said about what qualifies as history and how we go about it.
Sorry, he's taking over. He's taking over. All right, Monty, off you go.
He's got his own opinions. He's disagreeing with them. But yeah, no, I completely understand what you're saying, and I think that just goes back to us talking about how things change and understandings are not constant, and how we think about these things. And I mean, if we had this conversation in 1919, someone would probably be screaming at us for saying, "How dare you talk about it this way?" So it's a really interesting thing to me, and I do want to get back to kind of, because Scott raises an interesting context again. It's American, but it just, the wheels turn, and I can't not misinterpretation, literally misinterpretation, thinking that the Marine Corps Memorial, literally on the other side of the river in Virginia, is seen to be the Second World War Memorial, which exists now on the mall in BC. And I've heard people say that, right, that is the memorial, because that image of the Marines raising the flag on Mount Suribachi is one of the key visuals of America's war. So it's really interesting, I think, in a lot of ways, that necessarily what people are trying to say when they put it up, or what they mean it to be, doesn't mean that that's how we're going to take it.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. This goes right back to how memory is constructed, because these monuments may be cast in stone and bronze, but the meanings of them are always up for interpretation. And what does it? We'll go back to the original example that we were raised for the 1899 to 1902 on our National War Cenotaph. What does it mean that those dates are there? What does it like? What is the correct interpretation to assign to the fact that we have those dates that are on those wars? Does that mean that anyone who fought for Canada outside of those dates is not to be remembered? Does it mean that only those were? Does it mean that those were good and just wars, and that should be remembered as such? Like, it's the fact that those names and dates are on there, as you say, like it's like there may be an original intention, but often monuments and sites of remembrance grow into something else, and the original designers do not have full control over what that memory becomes and how that memory is. And there's my lovely wife in the background, scooping up Monty and taking him off. yeah. So sorry, the children coming and going
Yeah, it's all
is
good. It's all
disrupting my
good. Yeah, they
train of thought a little.
break your
Yeah,
train of
but
thought.
yeah, the original people who put it up, like what level of like they don't have control after it's created of like how it is interpreted, what it is ultimately going to be mobilized
Yeah,
for. Yeah. So and how people will react to it differently. I mean, there is a monument in downtown Montreal to the South African War.
Mhm.
That is it's nice. It's good. That was one of the recruiting places, and it was the and it reads differently now than it did 100 years ago. Like what is being celebrated, what is being remembered, okay, celebrated is the wrong word, but what is being commemorated, and what is being
Yeah,
what the ideals of being good imperial subjects in waging a war of aggression and subjugation is like that reads very differently to a modern audience, and it'll read
yeah,
differently 100 years from now too, when they're busy tearing down the statues of everyone who ate meat products
yeah.
or
You said that on Twitter. Hey, I
or
drove
drove
a
a
car.
vehicle at fossil.
Yeah,
I'm not the one who came up with that quote. That one stuck with me though, and I like that idea. I think
yeah. No,
it
it's a
goes
great way of
back
thinking
to
about it.
yeah, and in 100 years they'll be tearing down the statues of everyone who ate meat and who drove fossil fuel vehicles,
Yeah,
and which I mean I think goes to your point that these things, as much as we may think they're cast in stone and immutable, they're actually sites of contention. They are sites of interpretation, of misinterpretation. Is the popular idea, as Scott was pointing out, that the Marine Corps Memorial is
yeah,
in fact the Second World War Memorial? Is it wrong? I mean, like I guess it is factually wrong, and that people are not appreciating that, like
yeah,
what the original intention was. But at the same time, like the focus of memory has changed, and that raising of the flag on Iwo Jima has become so much more than was originally intended when that monument was put up. And is that wrong? I mean, is that bad? More than it might be factually incorrect, but is
yeah.
it? Yeah, it's an evolution of the memory. I expect.
Yeah, I think it's the evolution, and I mean that's what we keep coming back to. But and another thing, and don't want to take up too much more of your time because you got a lot going on, as we can literally see.
This is fun. I'm liking this. Although Monty seems to have stolen my poppy. I don't know where that wandered off to.
Oh man,
That's around here
children
somewhere.
do. Yeah, it happens. Anyway, yeah. Well, what I wanted to bring up too is and again, I think about these things in literally context because I live in Ottawa. I go downtown, not as much as I used to because I used to have to go for school, but in literally in terms of geography, because we talked about Australia, how theirs was purposefully done. Ottawa, it seems nothing is purposely done. Even the roads are not purposely done. That some of them intersections are just like they drunk when they designed this. Anyway, it's just I can't not think about that because we have the National Memorial right next to Parliament. If you walk 2 minutes, there's another South African memorial.
Hmm?
No one knows it's there. No one discusses it. It doesn't get talked about. I tried to dig into it for something else. I found next to nothing. So to me, it's just so interesting and how these things mesh together, particularly in Ottawa. It's a local memorial, but it's steps almost literally from the National Memorial, which now includes South Africa. I hear no one talking about that memorial or going to visit it.
And the only time
there.
I would submit that the only time you would ever hear anyone talk about it would be if there was some sort of movement to tear that statue down because it represented imperialism, a war of aggression, concentration camps, genocide, like name all of the things that actually happened in the South African War. And if someone if someone took it upon themselves to lobby to have that torn down, then suddenly it would suddenly the focus of memory would shift again, and that would become a very important memorial that right now at this moment nobody knows exists. And I think that's and again, I don't want to. I don't want to even say that I'm on the fence. I see the discussions around like the tearing down or changing of memorials. I see that as an opportunity to think about why they were there in the first place
Yeah,
and what,
exactly.
like that's I think that every statue that gets torn down is a chance to think about why it was there in the first place,
Mhm.
or to talk about why it was torn down, and that these are always discussions that are worth having. So yeah, again, I don't want to set anyone on against the little South African War memorial, but I think that it kind of speaks to your point about the construction of memory.
Yeah, and too, because again, there can be a lot of dichotomy here. You know, we love the statue, we hate the statue, like you just mentioned. And again, I think it's more complicated than that, and it definitely should be. But that's what I mean. I was thinking because I was accused of being selective, or what does it always say? You're changing history. I'm like, well, that's just literally impossible. But or whatever the things that people have thrown at me online all the time, or I'm whatever they keep calling me. But,
Literally impossible, or your complete job, that like complete just job description for the historian.
or you know, as an actual historians are supposed to do, or have a time machine, which would be so much more cool than being an actual historian. But here we are. It's just I've been accused of being selective or saying things are more important by saying that. I'm like, well, do you even know that there's a South African memorial right there? Or it also brings to mind Toronto has a massive, by Canadian standards, South African memorial.
Yep.
That is in the middle of a busy intersection that no one even looks at. It's just kind of there because I have stayed down that way a couple of times because I have friends living there. And I was literally watching people. Nobody even looked at it. People were crossing the street right next to it, didn't even look at it.
No,
so I mean,
they've seen it 1,000 times.
It's
just part of the furniture.
Yeah. So I mean, but if someone were to say, let's get rid of it,
yeah,
that's when it comes up. Or I mean, it's just so interesting because I can't remember the point you were making exactly, but in terms of importance, right? That was clearly it was made by Walter Allward as well, who did Vimy. At the time, it was clearly important. It was put in a prominent place so people could visit. Now it's in the middle, basically, of an intersection that is just madness because it's by U of T and a bunch of government stuff and down by the financial district. It's just seemingly in the way now. It's just everything is built around it just to get by it. And to me, it just no one said anything about that.
Yeah.
No one opposed that. And it's a crazy intersection of people. I can't remember the name of the streets off the top of my head because I'm not Torontonian, but it just speaks to me in so many ways about how what's selected to be remembered and how people remember going about doing their memories and their remembering. It's just sometimes I don't get offended, but just I get accused of things that those same people are doing. And that just hypocrisy drives me crazy for that reason.
There you go.
That's what it is to me. And I mean, I kind of preach in the choir as these are supporters of the channel and kind of the work I do. And we got some new fans of yours, I know now, because people are loving the Monty cameos, especially. But my
kids are the best thing about me. I'm the first to say that.
But you know what I mean? It's just I just want to bring context and discussion, and then when these things don't get discussed, that's what upsets me because we are just cherry picking, and I'm trying to eliminate that on all sides. I don't even see this as a dichotomy kind of issue. I don't. To me, it's way too intermixed for that to ever be. But that's just what I was trying to bring up. It's murky and it's messy, and
it's murky and it's messy, and this is, and I think the South African War stands out as and the reason that kind of rustled some jimmies, if you will, when you posted about that was because we like to frame our role in war in Canada in a positive light as the shock army of the British Empire. It's mixed with triumph. It's mixed with a sense of the just war we haven't had to grapple much with defeat or being on the wrong side of a war, like obviously being on the wrong side of a war. So that's not part of our war memory. If you compare it to like Germany was, I cited that as in the Twitter thread as well. Germany has war memorials for its dead of 1939 to 1945. They are very careful about what is being commemorated. You have to, like, it was a massive national tragedy. A lot of people lost their lives. So you have to approach it from they approach it from the perspective of trying to mourn the lives that were lost, while still accepting the guilt of we were clearly in the wrong here, and we clearly did horrible things, and the world had to gang up on us to stop us. And this was like, and that's kind of written out across their memorials. And it's not, and that's not something that Canada has had to grapple with. And so I think that something that questions those basic assumptions of triumph and justice in the wars that we have participated in is going to provoke a particularly fierce reaction from parts of Canadian culture in a way that it wouldn't necessarily in other countries. I think because our narrative is constructed in such a prescribed way. I think that was kind of the point I wanted to get to with linking your discussion of the 1899 to 1902 dates back with like kind of the international experience of war memory, because I think they speak to each other. I think they speak to why the memory is contested, and part of why people were getting so upset about it on the Twitter thread.
Yeah, I mean that's and because I just someone I was talking to, I don't want to bring up their name just because they gave me some really good advice about what I was trying to do, and now it didn't go well. She understood what I was trying to do, but it didn't go great. Anyway, besides the point is trying to understand the nuance. And someone said, that's removing the history again. I went, well, that's literally the opposite of what I'm doing here. I literally brought this up to talk about it. I think we should study this more. I don't think we should talk about South Africa less. I think we should talk about it more, because we just are missing a context that is so important to Canada and how Canada developed into the country that it is, and even something we haven't even talked about much here is the language divide.
Oh yeah.
Barely touched on, which you could talk about, and we've been talking about it for hundreds of years, and we barely touched on it today, very briefly, other than say conscription. But that is also part of South Africa that we just seem to forget. And why I was trying to bring up the context of, again, the whole thing with soldiers don't make policy, they just do what they're told. And I went, well, because of that language divide, that cultural divide at the time, that's just not the case. Like, that is literally, as I already said at the beginning, not true. And to me, that is so important. And it was so why I wanted the South African examples as well, or to talk about South Africa, because the language differences, but it's, and they've got other groups that were marginalized for a very long time, like you already mentioned with South Africa. It's just so interesting. It's just something I wanted to get into more, but it's just so difficult because I already had so much on the go. But that was kind of the idea, is to get what other people were thinking. I didn't think it was going to turn into some sort of backlash, but I guess I had too of an optimistic opinion of how things were going to go with that. But I mean, just because it's been discussed.
Honestly, I think you did a good job of raising that up, and I think you should do more of that as well. You absolutely should, and there are it just ties back, like, that very question ties back into, like, what is that memorial for? And it is, if my personal opinion on this is that it should not have, if it's going to be a national war memorial, it should not have any dates on it whatsoever. Exactly. And that this is like, take them all off, like, and not because these wars should not be remembered, but because if we're going to have a memorial that is based upon the loss of those Canadian lives, whether or not they were lost in pursuing policy interests that we now see as good or bad. If it's for the fallen, it should be for all the fallen. It should not just, and right now it's not. As it is currently constructed, it's not.
It's not. And
that's a point of that. Again, I have no power to make any of this stuff happen. That's just my opinion. But I think this is, we're historians. No one listened to us. But we, I think that's a solid question to ask in terms of what the intention is. But of course, if you start taking, like, any move to actually take the dates off of the war memorial, would be met with such vitriol and, like, such a tidal wave of bad feeling that, like, it's not even worth raising. But it is. I think that if anyone wants to think hard about how we construct war memory, that's kind of a really good case study in doing so, and, like, why certain things are there, why certain things were not there, when they were placed on there. As you pointed out, they're actually fairly recent additions. No, it's a really good, really controversial case study, and I applaud you for raising it.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't honestly put that much thought into it when I did it.
Yeah.
So these things just sort of happen, which
The best things are kind of fly by night, right?
Oh yeah, I mean that's why I kind of like what I do, because I'm so, in terms of that flexibility, I can just basically do whatever I want, whenever I want, and which I love. But it's just, yeah, I mean, again, I don't necessarily have the answers, and no one's going to listen to us anyway. Yeah, like that was some of the responses. Like people were like, I was personally there with like a crowbar about to rip those numbers off myself. I was just thinking jokingly, I said to my wife, like, I didn't even know how to take them off if I was allowed to. I'd be like hammering. I don't know what I'm doing here. Like, even if
you'll have to get Stephen Page and some of the people in there who have some hand knowledge of explosives to get them.
Yeah, I'd be like, I don't know if I can take them off if you let me. So like, let's take it down a notch. It's just a question, and again, that's it. It's just a question. It's trying to understand it, trying to understand why things are the way they are. Trying to constantly, and this is just my personal, but I look at this stuff to try to understand why Canada of today, of like literally, November 10th, 2022 is the way it is. And because these things have changed, right? These things have constantly been changing. Canada has changed. Even since those numbers were put up, Canada has had a lot of change. So, I mean, it's just why I ask them what I'm trying to do, trying to understand the country I live in, the city I live in, because we're a city that is the national capital. We've got our own local things going on, which is a whole other thing as well. And kind of why I brought up that other South African piece is because that gets lost as well. We're this national focus. We still live here. We still live our lives here. We're still Ottawans as well. Like, to me, it's just so interesting. And things I think that get forgotten sometimes, especially in these discussions, because people know I live here, but I'm like, we see things differently sometimes. And that's just because we live here. That's just how it is. We're not vacationing here for a couple of days, every 10 years as some families do, you know what I mean? So it's just how I think about it. And again, just wanting to discuss it is what I love doing as well. So, again, thanks for doing that with us. That was great.
Oh, a great pleasure. I had a lot of fun here.
Yeah. And it's great. And, you're heading down under. Yeah, you've done great work for Canadian military history, and the work you've done, I know, with Hill 70 and your other books, which are on the shelf behind me, are excellent. I'll link those down below after. Yeah, I mean, and a whole other thing we could do a whole other show on is about Marshall.
Oh God, yeah.
Yeah, I want to bring that up earlier.
I know we won't get into SLA Marshall.
Yeah, you and your speaking of minefields. And upsetting.
Well, that's a minefield I happily strode into like 15 years ago, and
it's great stuff.
Have enjoyed setting off all sorts of ordnance since then.
Oh, so, I love it. I love it too. I tried to do that dissertation. It got scrapped, unfortunately, but it's amazing. Anyway, I'll link some of your stuff down below because people should know.
Well, if you want to talk Marshall sometime, I'd be happy to come back and do this anytime.
We'll do it.
Even once we're down in Australia.
Yeah, probably.
Maybe especially so. It'll be good to link back to Canada every once in a while.
Yeah. We'll be your North American lifeline. Your North American connection, not lifeline connection, with our vast, Canadian.
Yeah, check in on me every once in a while. Make sure I haven't died of like Marmite poisoning or something.
Yeah, or the kangaroos got you, or koala attack or something. Anyway, yeah. So thanks, and everyone's liking the discussion. I mean, as I always like to tell people, and especially new guests, I mean, I didn't have to tell you this, but sometimes it's just the conclusions aren't really conclusions, but it's to get things talked about and to keep this up forever, right? I'm not going to take this video down, so it's just worthy of discussing it and understanding it, and hopefully people watch it afterwards and kind of try to understand what we're trying to do with what we do when we do history, right? It's not to offend. That's the thing. I know I just keep going back to that, but it's not to offend. It's just to understand. And some people
admittedly, when I do the SLA Marshall stuff, I do try to offend.
Yeah. I mean, it's deserving.
There's a group of people out there whose jimmies I really do try to wrestle with that. But that's for the most part, you're absolutely correct. Our job isn't to offend. Our job isn't to try to overturn the apple cart of memory. Like you in particular are a great advocate of memory and commemoration. education and the remembrance experience. And I think that that the fact that it's you raising these questions is a very is like it speaks volumes about the quality of the show and the questions you ask, but the necessity of doing so. So yeah, no, this has been great. Yeah, I'd be happy to come back anytime.
Oh yeah, I'd love to
talk about any weird stuff you want to talk about.
Oh yeah, we like the weird. We're big fans of weird here at OTD. I mean, even the name of the channel is weird, so we're all about the weird.
Awesome.
But yeah, no, it's just it's great to get these insights and to talk to somebody else and someone with your experience and research and your different experiences with places that you've done and worked and all that. It's great. Yeah, it's amazing that we were able to have this chat, especially with tomorrow, talking about memory and remembrance. That's all.
This is great. They don't ask me to come on CBC and run my mouth there or anything. So this is the for the national ceremony. So this is kind of my chance to get some thoughts on remembrance out there. So thank you very much for that.
Oh no, the pleasure is all mine. So thanks everyone for watching. We've got some stuff coming up just real quick at the end here. Next week, I can't remember. This week has been absolutely crazy. I've been dealing with a bunch of things, but anyway, I'll get stuff out about talking about all that, and we're going to get Rob back on because he said he's going to come back on, and I hold my guests to that. Mike Bechtold can speak on that. He keeps coming back on because he says he will, and I make him do it. So once you're in the net, we've got you. Yeah, there's no getting out. Yeah, so everyone stay up for that. And tomorrow, I don't know what I'll be doing. I'm going to be going to ceremonies, so everyone, I might do some streaming. I don't know. We'll see how the day goes. Apparently, the weather's supposed to be downright awful here, so that might limit me. But that said, everyone, thanks for watching, and thanks for Rob for coming on. Like you said, you enjoyed and weren't putting you out too much by doing this?
Oh no, not at all. This is good. This is almost actually my work day is just starting in Australia. Yeah, so I've got some meetings to get to down at the not physically, but I've got some virtual meetings to chime into down at the War College there. So this was a lot of fun before the work day starts for me.
Yeah, before doing the actual work. I get that. All right, everyone. So thanks for watching and thanks for everyone participating in this discussion. It was a great one, and I learned a ton as well. So thanks everyone for chiming in. It was great. So I'll see everybody on the next live stream. Have a good day, everybody.
Bye, everyone. Thanks for joining us.